There is this fear that it will get kicked from the Tories to Labour. Just across the board, it's quite devastating that our government is unwilling to address these wrongs. It was known, this risk, we imported the product.
Yeah.
Politicians allowed it to continue to be used when the risks were clear. Patients weren't told anything. I'm hoping that now there's this public awareness that will help keep pressure on the government. Government reputation is damaged when the public know that something's happened.
Cara McGoogan, hello, how are you?
Hi, I'm good, thanks. Very tired, but surviving.
I'm sure you've been doing a lot over the last couple of days, not least because you are the author of The Poison Line, a true story of death, deception and infected blood, and of course the infected blood report published yesterday. So tons of media, tons of interviews, tons of breakdowns, I'm assuming.
Yeah, it was an emotional day yesterday. Lots of fighting back tears, also moments of excitement. It was overwhelming to see all those hundreds of people at the Central Hall in Westminster and arriving finally at this day that they've waited decades for.
I can only imagine. Maybe just by way of introduction for our audience, tell us who you are and what you do.
Yep, so I'm a journalist. I'm the author of this book, The Poison Line. I work at The Telegraph in my day job, and I make a podcast series called Bed of Lies, which is an investigative documentary series. And so my second series was about the infected blood scandal. And 5 years ago, pretty much this month, I was at the opening of the infected blood inquiry. And I came to this completely cold. I had no idea really what it was. I'd just seen a note saying this inquiry was opening. And as a feature writer, I was like, I'll go down and see what it's about. And I was so harrowed by the stories I heard those first days. I wrote 2 back-to-back features that weekend. And then kind of going on to do my podcast, I was like, we really need to dig into this and make something that's accessible and engaging so that people can understand this complex, disastrous subject.
Okay, so for people then who perhaps like you 5 years ago are coming to this relatively cold, don't understand what it's about, don't know what it's about, where should we start?
So in the 1970s, Britain licensed this new treatment for haemophilia. Now, haemophilia is a genetic bleeding disorder where people lack a protein in their blood needed to form clots. So without that protein, if you sort of knock your elbow, you'd have a debilitating internal bleed and your joint could swell and it's really painful. This new treatment, Factor VIII, came in, and it's a concentrated form of that protein, and it's derived from human plasma. So they take the plasma donations from thousands of people and take off the layer of Factor VIII and make this white powder. But what happened was we were importing this from America, and the pharmaceutical companies in America were going to high-risk sources for that plasma and making this highly dangerous product that first contained hepatitis, and then in the early 80s, with the development of the AIDS crisis, it contained HIV.
Some of those high-risk sources, I think places like prisons, right?
Yeah, so what I've done is spoken to lawyers who actually uncovered a plasma center in one of America's most notorious prisons, Louisiana State Penitentiary. This place is mad. It has an annual rodeo, and people come from all over the world to go and watch prisoners compete with one another in the rodeo. Bull riding, yeah, like charging into one another. There's actually kind of descriptions of prisoners saying that they would, rather compete in the rodeo and get some time out in hospital recovering because it would be a break from being in prison.
What?
Yeah, a brutal environment.
It's kind of like, it's like the Colosseum, isn't it? It's like subjecting prisoners to that sort of thing. That's crazy.
Yeah,
wow.
Yeah, truly mad. I haven't yet managed to get to the rodeo. There's been a couple of instances where I was in Louisiana a week after the rodeo a couple of years ago, and I was like, I just missed it. It's twice a year.
Yeah.
But you can see on YouTube videos of it. It's just crazy.
Well, I know what I'm doing after the interview.
Yeah.
I'm checking that out.
But so this prison is this whole lifestyle. It's kind of a functioning town. It's the size of Manhattan. Thousands of prisoners. And they work the farm. They farm their own vegetables. And then particularly grim thing that they do, they build their own coffins. It's one of these industrial complexes that we don't have here, thank God. But one of the industries within the prison back in the 70s and 80s was a plasma center. And prisoners actually functioned as kind of medical staff in the plasma center. They checked one another in, they wiped down their arm, and they injected them to remove their plasma, put the plasma bags in the freezers and got them ready for pharmaceutical companies to try and and got them ready for pharmaceutical companies to come and collect. But what was happening was lawlessness. Prisoners having sex in toilet cubicles while they waited to donate, turning up with kind of intravenous drug marks, having tested positive hepatitis B, but they just bribe one another. Oh, here's a packet of cigarettes, so can I still donate today? So viruses were rife. And going back to that making of factor VIII, you only needed one infection to contaminate a whole batch. So you put thousands of donations together from prisons in Louisiana, Arkansas, Nevada, across America, added to collecting in the center of American cities, paying impoverished people for their plasma, also high risk of intravenous drug use, sex work. And there's stories of setting up mobile trucks outside nightclubs at the height of the AIDS crisis. And American lawyers found adverts actually advertising to gay men who had had hepatitis B before, because they wanted to use their plasma, one part of it, to make hepatitis B immunoglobulin to help people. But what they did was took the rest of the plasma, made factor VIII. People with hepatitis B were most at risk of contracting HIV when it emerged, because it's a bloodborne virus. So if you're contracting one bloodborne virus, you're at risk of another.
You mentioned the pharmaceutical companies, and we'll come to that later on when we talk about culpability and how you would go about prosecuting anyone for their involvement in this. But just for a kind of news overview, shall we say, this 2,000-page long document gets published yesterday. Now, I'm not expecting you to have read the whole thing in the 24 hours, but if you'd be able to run us through kind of key findings, what we understand to have happened as a result of this report being published, I think it would be useful for a lot of our listeners. Yeah,
so the headline is, "This was not an accident. Mistakes were made and it shouldn't have happened. These infections of 1,250 people with haemophilia with HIV, up to 5,000 with hepatitis, and then parallel scandal of 26,800 or so infected with hepatitis C from blood transfusion. These should never have happened." For me, sitting in the room and hearing the kind of like introduction to the report and some of the findings we were going to see in there, the one that kind of gave me shivers was factor VIII should never have been licensed for use, imported from America in 1973. We should never have had this treatment. So it wasn't about individual mistakes in how it was made or how it was used, or, oh, we used slightly too much of it. It was, we should never have used this. And so that for me is kind of the crux of the book. If you'd intervened and banned that at the start of the poison line, it would never have, we would not have had this line of infection from prisons in America to patients in the UK. Another part for me that was crucial was throughout 1982, 83, 84, 85, we were sluggish in our response to the AIDS crisis. Doctors and health officials kind of delayed acknowledgement that AIDS could be caused by a bloodborne agent. And so in 83, as we have our first patients in the UK with haemophilia showing signs of AIDS, Ken Clarke is out there saying there's no conclusive proof. And we're still injecting patients through 84 and into the beginning of 85 with the dangerous treatment. But in the report yesterday, it said from July 1982, January 1983 at the latest, we should have acknowledged that AIDS could be spread through some bloodborne agent, and we should have reacted appropriately. So that's years before we did.
And not only did we not act appropriately, one of the other key findings was that there'd been this cover-up, right? The exact quote is a subtle, pervasive and chilling cover-up. I mean, can you tell us a little bit about what that involved?
Yeah, so from the moment of diagnoses in 85 for HIV, 91 for hepatitis C, we've had a 40-year cover-up. And that has involved hospitals and the Department of Health covering up what happened. And there's a whole section of the report dedicated to the shredding of documents within the Department of Health. For years, the Department of Health tried to put this down as like, oh, some junior person who didn't know what they were doing shredded these documents by mistake. An absolutely outlandish claim. And that has been proved to not be true.
No.
Shock. Also, Lord David Owen, a health minister in the 70s, tried to get hold of his documents from when he was health minister. And he was told, with our policy of destroying documents after 10 years. These ones have been destroyed. And he was like, I have never heard of this policy. My Foreign Office papers still exist. I've sent them to a university for safekeeping. So why have my papers from that period been destroyed? And so Brian has kind of, exposed this at long last and given us a sense that those campaigners for all those years were essentially being institutionally gaslit.
Mm. You mentioned a couple of political figures there. Ken Clarke being one who's now sits in the Lords. Obviously, prime ministers of all stripes. Most recently, you'd be looking at sort of, May, although she announced the inquiry, Cameron, Brown, Blair. You just go back and recite the list, right? That there is a cross-party, institutional, political failing. First of all, to grasp the nettle and announce the inquiry, to compensate. I mean, what political repercussions do you view as, first of all, likely, but I guess maybe a better question would be just in response to this? What's the judgment? What's the beneficial outcome or ideal outcome as a result of this politically?
So we've seen that apology yesterday that came from both sides, which I think people did find very meaningful. Some think it was too little too late, but I did hear a lot of people were feeling quite moved and thankful that had finally happened and that Rishi Sunak went into the detail he did. Compensation, I guess, is the next thing to talk about, which is a form of justice punishment from the government. But there is this fear that it will get kicked from the Tories to Labour with an election. Today we've heard that these next batch of interim payments of £210,000 will be paid by the summer. But then there's a bit of a slightly vague setting up of a compensation body, and it's going to take a lot of time. The Tories haven't set aside a pot and given us a figure today. And so are they doing that in order to kind of kick that number into the Labour Party's budget? And so you still see a bit of political wrangling going on here. And just across the board, it's quite devastating that our government is unwilling to address these wrongs, right? From Margaret Thatcher all the way to today. I think sometimes I wonder if all my investigations, it's just all roads lead back to Thatcher.
Usually.
Yeah. She was, the reason we didn't compensate in the beginning, her and Ken Clarke didn't want to introduce an American system where any patient can sue the hospital and damage the NHS because of mistreatment. But this is a very unique instance. It's not it was known, this risk. We imported the product. Yeah. Politicians allowed it to continue to be used when the risks were clear. Patients weren't told anything, and it had devastating effects. I'm hoping that now there's this public awareness that will help keep pressure on the government, because really that's the main thing, isn't it? That government reputation is damaged when the public know that something's happened.
Two questions on that. The first, you spoke there about the public the reaction of the people directly involved in this, right? The victims, I guess, or at least the relatives and friends of the victims if they've sadly died. And it was quite striking that when Sir Brian sort of announced, here we go, here it is, received a standing ovation, which, you do not have to look at many other sort of public scandals and inquiries. In recent memory, Grenfell would be the obvious one. The people involved in that are very unhappy about the way that it's proceeding and the way that it's panning out. Not so here. Why do you think that is?
Sir Brian, it has this sort of aura to him. He's a tiny man, but he also has such power. And he feels like such a safe pair of hands. Like, I've been at the inquiry over the last 5 years, and he's very kind of quiet and astute, and he sits there with a fountain pen and takes notes every now and then. But you can almost see when he takes a note, it's like, oh, something's been said there that was relevant. And then he'll just come in with a very insightful but, not over-laden comment. So it was good when Clarke was on the stand. He sort of came in and said, Mr. Clarke, I think you'll find it's my decision of what's relevant to this inquiry. Nice. So I think people have kind of watched him over the last 5 years at the front of the inquiry, and they've come to feel really fond of him, and that their lives are finally in his hands. And so when he came out, you just saw this outpouring of all of that yesterday, and I think they were so pleased of what he said in his report and kind of how critical it was. And yeah, he came out to a standing ovation, and then he just said, no, this isn't me. If anyone, it's my team. But really, it's you. And then he said, look to your left, look to your right, look around you, and now applaud again and applaud one another. And I just think that was such a nice gesture. He's got no ego in this, but he is the man that sort of changed it all.
Yeah, sounds like a fascinating guy, fascinating character. The second question I wanted to ask was about public reaction. And I don't know if you've been able to sense this, and maybe it might just be completely anecdotal and be my perspective and therefore wrong. But I'm not sure if the scale, the scope and the horror of this is really landing with the public, right? It's decades long, it's complicated, it's technical. There is clearly a scandal that's taken place. But I don't know whether, to compare it to Hillsborough, right? And I'm not suggesting we do some kind of trauma Olympics, right? Far more people have died as a result of this. Same with Grenfell. It just doesn't feel like it's catching in the same way. And that might just be my perspective, but I don't know if you have a view on that, or the kind of lack of media interest, I don't know how to describe it. You understand what I'm getting at? Yeah, totally. And it's something I've come up against over the last 5 years. When I tell people that I'm working on this book, often I'm met with a kind of like, did some people get HIV? There's a very little kind of public awareness of what actually happened here. And I think that is partly because it's so complicated, and that it spans such a long period of time. It's not easy to point the blame and say they were at fault. If anything, I think it's been, for me, crucial to kind of pin the pharma companies and name them, Baxter, Bayer, Armour, Alpha, if you'll let me get away with that. It's in the book, legally watertight. I will let you get away with it, yeah. Because they are sort of entities that you can look to. So I think that's part of it. It's very complicated. It's hard for people to get their heads around. I think within a news story, you've barely summarised what's happened to then convey news. It's really hard to kind of get this into a 1,000-word piece. Yeah. The other thing that people often talk about, so more people have died than all those other disasters combined. Yeah. But there isn't one image. There's not the Hillsborough Stadium. There's not the Grenfell Tower. There's something in our public consciousness where we know that symbol, we know those words, and that one moment of mass casualty. This was kind of really private, painful deaths over a long period, and also the stigma of AIDS back in the 80s and 90s and even today means that those victims have been unable to really speak vocally for fear of what backlash they might get. So many of my sources are still anonymous. One of the lead campaigners who kind of helped make the blood inquiry happen is still anonymous. And he said to this day, if people in his village knew that he had HIV, he fears that there would be backlash. Other people say that when they leave the inquiry, they take off their pin because they don't want people on the train to know that they're HIV positive. So we're dealing with kind of decades of that too, which I think harms the ability to get this into public consciousness. So yeah, I think there's been a lot everywhere this week, but it's also so grim and sad that I hope that in kind of going after the pharmaceutical companies, showing those mistakes that were made and laying out the kind of nuts and bolts of scandal, that in the podcast and the book, it makes it accessible and interesting, but we'll see. Yeah, and I wonder actually if there's a bit of a lesson there in the post office scandal, right? Going on publicly for years doesn't really catch the imagination, and then someone get on the phone to the ITV producers and get them to serialise. I'm sure you'd be very happy if they turn this into a series. Well, they're making a rival drama, so bastards. So let's talk about culpability then. You mentioned a couple of pharmaceutical companies there, and the point I've kind of, when I've spoken about other scandals and inquiries, right, publicly, the most recent one was the post office. I was on LBC talking about it, or whether it's Windrush or Grenfell, or indeed Hillsborough, and we're very bad at actually pinpointing the person and sort of putting them in prison. Now, I know clearly the scale and scope of this, it is not just one person. And I think there was, maybe it was Andy Burnham, I think possibly, talking about possibly corporate manslaughter charges, that we kind of have a justice system that's very good at identifying, someone gets stabbed, this person committed the stabbing, we'll hold them responsible. I don't necessarily know if we have the apparatus for something as dense, multifaceted as this to conduct that kind of prosecution. So in terms of criminal culpability, how do you see this panning out? So I know
from yesterday, speaking with lawyer Des Collins, who's one of the leading lawyers on this. He's quite keen on going after corporate manslaughter. And he's got his eye on a couple of institutions more than people. So be it hospitals or schools. I don't know if we want to name those at this point. Probably not.
We don't.
So he's interested in thinking about that, I think. The inquiry didn't recommend anything to the CPS. In France, 2 doctors went to jail. There might have been a case against the leading haemophilia doctor who was advising the government, Professor Arthur Bloom. He had a patient with AIDS in his hospital, and he was kind of writing a suspected AIDS into his medical notes and then going out in public and saying, we don't have any cases here, so there's nothing to worry about. And his language, I do a sort of day-by-day breakdown in the book of what's happening with that patient and what he's saying publicly. And he slowly shifts in public. He might say, well, if we've got any cases, it's only mild. But what's a mild case of AIDS? This guy was dying. It was not mild. And so his sort of knowledge of the risks, his relationship with pharmaceutical companies, his advice to the government could reach that level. But he died in 1993, I believe it was. 1992, maybe?
In the 90s.
In the 90s, 2 weeks after the French doctors were imprisoned. And he died of a brain hemorrhage. So some people suspect that was stress-related because seeing what his peers were going through in France. But this many years on, I find it really hard to think that we would be able to bring criminal charges against any one institution. And the pharma companies were in America. They've since done a very clever restructuring, selling off, merging. They all say, we're not the person who it was. You need to speak to them. The new people say, well, we weren't the ones. We didn't have it then. You've got to speak to them. And it's all like this. They did face criminal charges in Canada, but were never convicted. And that was it. With Japan was the only place to prosecute 3 pharmaceutical executives, and they all got short prison sentences, a year or 2.
See, that for me is very revealing about the structures of power in this country. And I'd invite you to comment on and ask you to speak about the sort of the function of inquiry and report. That you have thousands of people dying. You have a deliberate cover-up. And yet you and I are still sat here going, well, I don't actually know if anyone's going to go to prison over this. And that actually perhaps the very mechanism itself of inquiry and report is a political device which goes, right, we've now extended the time horizon on this to anywhere between, let's say, 4 and 8 years for the evidence to be collected, the report to be compiled and be published, all of our political careers.
50 years for Bloody Sunday, no?
Yeah, well, exactly, you know. And that, 50 years later, you still get a Conservative minister saying that we're going to end vexatious prosecutions, which is essentially to just protect Soldier F. Anyway, you know, that's a conversation for another day, Cara, I think.
Bed of Lies 3.
There we go. Oh, is it actually?
The Troubles.
Nice. Very good. But you essentially go, we'll all be out of politics then. It'll be someone else's problem. Bish, bash, bosh, job done.
Yeah. Yeah, Theresa May announced the inquiry. There's been had many prime ministers since then. Yeah. So, you know, Rishi Sunak delivers that apology, but I think could fairly say I had nothing to do with this. This inquiry's been going on my whole tenure. So this apology is for other people that come before me, not really from me. And so that is a case you sort of kick the can down the road. I think in this instance, for the survivors and bereaved families, the inquiry was so about getting to the truth and having recognition after 40 years of denial, 35 years, that it provided a service maybe beyond pointing the finger of blame. But yeah, it's a question. I've become a bit of an advocate for a public inquiry, but maybe that's wrong. Maybe they just are very costly. I think this costs £30 million a year roughly. And then we're going to have the compensation bill. If we just compensated properly in 1991, we'd have ultimately saved a lot of money rather than sort of Thatcher's government saying we don't want to pay that bill now. So yeah, I think that moment meant a lot for people, and the uncovering of documents and the kind of outlining of blame. But we've had 2 inquiries on this subject before now, both of which one of which had no powers. It was a House of Lords member set it up. It was critical, but the Department of Health didn't provide any evidence or documents, and the government ignored it. The Penrose inquiry in Scotland was a statutory inquiry in Scotland, didn't have powers to compel witnesses from Westminster. Again, the Department of Health didn't help, and therefore its conclusions were that nothing was done wrong, and campaigners deemed it a whitewash, and they burnt the report in the street and shouted at the chair on his kind of... So the difference between the standing ovation Sir Brian got and the shouting that happened there. So it has been meaningful. I wouldn't want to take that away, and I wouldn't want to kind of undermine its power for the fact that it won't bring any prosecutions. But I think with the COVID inquiry, it's happened really soon after. So it'll be interesting to see the end of that if the fact of kind of having it quickly makes a difference. Yeah,
absolutely. And your point, I mean, it's clearly not just a financial aspect to this. But when you look at the sums that some of the other countries have paid out in compensation compared to the kind of £10 billion figure that's being mooted here, even just from, if you wanted to be totally hard-nosed Westminster cynic about it, it's like if you'd have sorted this out 30 years ago, you wouldn't be paying as much money now. Cara, thank you so much for coming in. The Poison Line, out this week, I do believe. Am I right in saying that?
It came out the paperback was out on Thursday.
Paperback out on Thursday, perfect. The Poison Line, ladies and gentlemen, a true story of death, deception, infected blood. There's the subtitle as requested.
Thank you.
Cara, thank you so much for coming in. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.
Cheers.